We'll do the intro. You want to start it?
Sure, sure. Uh, hey, everybody, welcome back to another episode of the Naked Diner podcast. I know that we're doing episodes a little few and far between right now. It's been that kind of summer, but we've got a good one for you. And why don't you tell everybody who our guest is this week?
Our guest today is Professor Kevin Schultz from the University of Illinois in Chicago. He wrote this great book called Why Everyone Hates White Liberals, including white liberals. And to tell you the truth, we had a discussion. I wouldn't say an argument because that would be too brash, but we did have a discussion about white liberals. Is that a fair way to put
Yeah,
it?
I think that's white liberals and why they why that terminology just doesn't work anymore.
Yes, yes, exactly.
There's a
But
lot of
yeah,
branding issues involved.
yep, I had a really fun time doing this as I typically do. And yeah, yeah.
Yeah, good talk. All right, everybody. Well, thank you for watching. We hope you're going to enjoy this one. You can find our stuff down in the links and like and subscribe. I guess we're supposed to say that, right?
We're supposed to say that, but we're not really good at promoting ourselves, are we?
No, we're actually really terrible at it.
Great content, bad at promotion.
Yeah.
That's our brand.
Well, it's easy to stand on a soapbox and tell the world what's going wrong. But in court or the street in this miserable heat, we need more than just catchy songs. I want to inspire, not preach to the choir. Shouting the slogans, righteous and solemn, reading the books and joining the column. Aware of our troubles, but not how to solve them. And sometimes I feel like I'm part of the problem. Like I'm part of the problem.
Well, I suppose we should do some kind of introduction, right? I mean, it is the Naked Diner podcast with Jack Maturko and me, Andy Hall, our guest, Professor Kevin M. Schultz, Professor of History, Catholic Studies, and Religious Studies over at the University of Illinois at Chicago. And how do I know all these things? I am reading it from his card that he personally gave me when I met him at a book event. I'm going to call it a book event over at Symposium Books. That's a plug over in Providence, Rhode Island. What a wonderful time I had there, Professor Schultz.
Thanks. I had a great time too. What a great conversation.
Yeah, yeah. So, Professor Schultz's book is, and this is going to be very, oh, the cat's gone. That's sad. Very glittery. Why Everyone Hates White Liberals, including white liberals. And down here in black, you can really very see it's a history. I would say, Professor Schultz, it's also a how-to book, but I don't want to let's like to tease it towards the end because I think it's a how-to book also. But I'm just going to ask the hacky and hit the nail on the head question: why does everyone hate white liberals? And I'm going to use the word especially white liberals.
Great question. And a funny story about that. How I came to write this book was, like everybody in America, I was really concerned and worried and fascinated by the polarization that we have in our American life, where it's not just our politics that are being fiercely contested from right and left, but now it's like what neighborhood you move to, who you date, what you set your Tinder profile to, all these kinds of things. I don't know how, well, anyway, we'll skip that one. But I was worried about the whole polarization in American life. And I was teaching this class to a bunch of middle schoolers, which I just do for fun/extra money. And we were talking about how to argue politics in American life and not lose friends. And so we used a whole bunch of data points from Gallup and all these other Quinnipiac polls and things like that. And what we found was that there was this bell curve of belief on any number of issues, on abortion, on the role of religion in American public life, on gun safety laws. There was this vast center in American life, but neither party really seemed to be embodying that. So for instance, just to use one common sort of poll, for the last 60 years, a majority of Americans believe abortion should be legal for the first trimester, and then the polling falls off drastically after the first trimester, with the very extreme saying it should be legal throughout any time, and other extremes saying it should never be legal at all. And so the students, these 7th and 8th graders, were like, where is the American center? Where is the center of American politics? And I started to think about my other books, which have all been about the 1930s, the 1940s, the 1950s, the 1960s especially. And this center used to be called liberalism. And so I said, what happened to this liberal center that now these students don't feel like there's anybody who's voicing this center of American politics? So then I came up with my partner. She suggested the title of this book is Why Does Everyone Hate White Liberals, including even white liberals? We'd walk our dog around our neighborhood or engage in some community activism kind of thing, and everybody would be hating on white liberals everywhere. And white liberals would seem to be inviting it by putting lawn signs in their yard and doing all of these virtue signaling kind of things. And so this became sort of the idea fixe of the book. And then a friend of mine asked me directly, so if that's the title of your book, what is the answer? So Andrew, you're not the first person to ask me this question directly. And I didn't have a good answer, but now I think I do. So I'm going to test it out for you all, and you can tell me if it sucks or if it works. But the answer is, in part, it was an assassination. There was this middle of American politics that was liberalism, and it was supposed to be between communism on the left and fascism on the right. That's sort of where the liberal center sort of got its idea. Arthur Schlesinger, the great historian and political activist during the Kennedy years, called it the vital center, which was the name of his book. This literally, the title is The Vital Center. But then starting the 50s, 60s, and 70s, you get people on the right who start saying we need more space for our politics. People like Barry Goldwater is sort of the standard bearer. William F. Buckley is the one that everybody knows as far as sort of the intellectual of this right-wing movement. They started attacking not the left, because the left was basically, didn't have a lot of traction in American life, but they started attacking the liberal center. And then on the left-hand side of things, especially during the 1960s, you get a completely different attack on liberals and liberalism coming from the left. So liberalism is defined by those on the left not as sort of creeping communism or creeping socialism, but in fact sort of the opposite, where it's just a beard for capitalism. This is Obama bailing out the banks instead of bringing wealth to the poorer people, redistributing the economic structure in American life or anything like that. So the left sees liberals completely differently, but they attack liberals to create more space for themselves. African Americans do this, Black activists do it during the civil rights movement, because they see white liberals as only willing to go so far to bring about racial equality. And so it's this assassination from all sides. And if you think of a circle, with a circular firing squad, they all kill the beast in the middle, which is in this case the white liberal, and now they're all shooting each other. And in some ways, that's sort of where I see our politics today. So that's my quick answer, was an assassination. I would be remiss to stop there if you give me one more minute to say one other thing, is that there is something inside of liberalism as an idea that invites critiques. It invites self-critiques. It invites this amorphic sense that what liberalism is can shift and change. So to nerd out for a quick second, the word liberalism comes from the Latin word liber, which means freedom or free. So the whole purpose of liberalism, definitionally, is to enhance freedom for Jack, for Andrew, for Kevin, for anybody who's listening to this. How do I maximize my freedom? And I want to be free from the yokes of power that are all around us, whether that's the church or whether that's kings and queens. In our era, those that are mostly oppressing us have been seen to be the oligarchs in big business. And so for 100+ years, liberalism has been the use of governments to sort of push back against the power of big business. But because liberalism is this amorphic thing that is not a set of policies, but instead is this sensibility that we need to maximize freedoms by admitting that we have some relationship to our society, that the common weal, the common good is a big part of how we actually embrace individual freedom, that has invited critiques saying, well, where do we draw the boundary between my freedom and social responsibility? And how can we find that proper balance? And because there is no fixed definition, liberals themselves will engage in question and answer periods trying to readjust the boundary because things have changed. Or people will be attacked and liberals will accept those attacks because they're open to trying to find ways to enhance more individual freedoms at the expense of social and common good. So there is this sort of internal problem within liberalism that invites these critiques. And once those have been exposed, in the story that I get to tell in that little tiny word that you mentioned, a history, there are these three lines of attack that still exist with us today.
So with this, the definition or this kind of looking inward with liberalism, does this project this image that liberals are fake because they change their opinions?
Yeah, they are open to that critique. Let's put it that way. Liberals themselves might not see themselves as being fake, but they would see themselves as being open to other voices, being willing to change their minds if somebody can convince them using mostly rational thought that their central ideas are not effective or are not working. So because they have this adaptability built into their system, they get accused all the time of being phonies or of being fakes, because they don't have
being wishy-washy. Like they that willingness to self-reflect and change your mind comes off as, oh, you're not fighting for it hard enough.
Right. Absolutely. And even worse than that, you're virtue signaling, because you're putting that lawn sign in your front yard that says, in this home we believe these certain things, but in reality your neighborhood is mostly white and you're perfectly fine paying a pretty low tax rate so that you're not enhancing the real commonweal. So there's a little bit of not just wishy-washy, although that's exactly right, because you're not willing to put anything on the line. One of the great critiques that comes out of the civil rights movement against white liberals is that they're NIMBYs, not in my backyard. Like, yeah, let's have social change in Georgia and Alabama, but we're not going to bring it up to Massachusetts and Rhode Island and Chicago, where I am. And that's, of course, where Martin Luther King faced some of his most violent threats, was when he came up to Chicago.
Is that when the whole thing started going sideways? Is when busing started happening? When, like in Boston, things went completely haywire during busing? Is this when everyone started piling on liberals?
Yeah, it happens a little before the busing initiatives, but in that same chapter, you can really start to see it. The clearest example as far as timing goes on this question is, to me, when you look at the Black activists, people like, even Martin Luther King, but James Baldwin, Lorraine Hansberry, Gwendolyn Brooks, there was always this leery and cautious relationship between Black activists and moderates or white liberals. But in this period, in the 1950s and early 1960s, there is this genuine hope that comes from the Black community. You can see it in James Baldwin's Fire Next Time from 1962 in the New Yorker, 1963, when it actually gets published as a book. And that is about the white liberals and Black advocates coming together and reshaping America on grounds of true equality. And of course, the famous line that ends that book is that if these two things do not happen, these two groups do not come together, we'll have the fire next time, right? That's where the title of the book comes from. And in 1963, 64, in those 2 years, you watch this frustration grow and grow and grow from the Black community, such that by 1964, the Black community is pillaring the white liberals for not going far enough. And the great irony here is that 1964 is, of course, when they passed the Civil Rights Act of 1964. And in the year after that, it's the Voting Rights Act of 1965. And it's really white moderates, white liberals that are propelling this through the halls of Congress. But Black voices are saying, yeah, these laws are great and important and necessary, but what we really need is a moral endeavor to challenge inequality in American life, not just legal fixes that set the ground for equality, but don't actually bring about true equality. So it starts in this sort of early 60s, mid 60s period. And race is a very important but not singular element in this turn against liberals. And from there, when those lines of attacks get built, then all of a sudden things like busing happen, like you're talking about, and they get built into these sort of pathways that have already been paved for how we're supposed to hate liberals. And so by the time busing comes out, I mean, that great picture from 1976 of one of the activists using the American flag to stab the civil rights lawyer in Boston. I mean, what a remarkable image, right? And that is an attack on liberal endeavors to bring about some level of equality.
I think I'm a union guy. I'm pro-union.
I'm sorry for the last 50 years that you've had to experience.
And sir, this is exactly what I think. It's a little bit more than 50 years, because I learned about the Taft Taft-Hartley Act of 1947. This is important. It seems like inside baseball for a lot of people, but this seems to be pretty important in terms of why we don't have democratic institutions in this country. But go ahead. You want to tell us about the Taft-Hartley Act?
Look, I was part of a union until I became the chair of my department, and now I'm the man. So I'm not allowed to be in the union, but I am a strong union advocate as well. And I've seen my union, make mistakes and ask for too much and do these policy positions and all the things that unions are accused of. But I've also seen it bring about truly remarkable salary and wage increases. And even more important than that is the protection of workers and making sure that everybody gets employed no matter where they are in the hierarchy. So I love being a leader of my department, but one of the costs of that for me was that I was kicked out of the union until I'm done with my term as chair and fall up into faculty is how I like to think about it, not fall back into faculty. So that's sort of my stance on unions is I have real world experience of how I've seen it benefit people's lives, not just, fancy professors, but also sort of contingent faculty who are making a few $1,000 to teach a class to 200 kids, stuff like that. That's so I've seen it. Right now we have, under 10% of the American workforce is unionized. I think it's 7 or 8% or something like that. And the largest union in the United States is, of course, the Service Workers Union. So I bring that up only to suggest that this epochal change that you're referring to. So unions were highly contested terrain, obviously, 100 years ago in the 1900s, the 1910s, the 1920s. Anytime there was a union activist, it goes back to the great railroad union revolts of the 1877 period and onward. I'm in Chicago, where so much of the sort of union battles of the late 19th century happened. We've got the McCormick Plant Works over here. We've got my campus is really close to some of the sort of the Haymarket Square area. A bar I go to is the Haymarket Pub. It's just down the street from where I teach. So, I mean, this is a union place. And if there was a union uprising, the president would just bring in the National Guard and break the unions. That's what happened in the late 19th and early 20th century. The Great Depression happens 1929 for a variety of reasons. Most famously, of course, the stock market crash, but also other in sort of instabilities in the American economy. And the Great Resolution in sort of broad terms here is Franklin Delano Roosevelt, FDR, and his introduction of the New Deal, which was a hodgepodge of programs. But what it did at large was it changed the nature of the American economy, really putting the US federal government on the side of the worker. And one of the key provisions that he passed in his New Deal was Article 7A of the NARA, which made union organizing legal. And it meant that there were operations in place mandated by the federal government to allow these things to be legal and to provide mechanics and mechanisms for employers and workers to actually sort of converse and mediate their disputes. So rather than send in the National Guard, which had been the norm, now the American government is saying, okay, we got to mediate and we got to find a new deal, to use their language, for the American worker. This is when you get this huge expansion of union membership. It goes up to 20, sometimes 25% of the American workforce. They're mostly involved in manufacturing. So I said earlier it was service. It was mostly in manufacturing. And that's important to see the decline because American manufacturing fades starting in the late 60s and picking up in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, as we all basically know. But there is this conservative turn in the 1940s against this sort of union activism. It stems from a very specific moment. I mean, there have been longstanding, especially by the owners, antipathy towards unions, but it stems from this very specific moment when these 9 million American service members, people in the Army during World War II and the Navy and the Air Force and the Marines, come back and join the workforce. Wages decline because there's a huge number of workers. Prices skyrocket because everybody's starting to buy stuff again because now these regulations are off so people can buy stuff. There's a mammoth amount of strikes. 1946 is actually one of the largest years of strikes in American history. And there is this turn against it, which, as you point out, is the Taft-Hartley Act. And that then starts putting limitations on what unions are able to do and how unions are able to organize, and what the federal government's role is in the ability to mediate union strikes. And this starts this long decline of union enrollment, and it starts this sensibility that the federal government is no longer going to be on the side of the worker, but it's going to be more calling balls and strikes as a neutral umpire, but even preventing and not necessarily allowing or mandating workers be part of unions if the workers vote to unionize. So it is this sort of first real devastating cut to the ability of unions to organize and then to have strength at the bargaining table. And this kind of continues up and through the second half of the 20th century.
Thank you. Thank you. I found that to be very interesting because, my dad was a union guy. He worked for the telephone company when it was the telephone company. I remember him going out on strikes. And when I tell my kids who are now in their 20s about the bygone era of when you could just have one income for one family, it seems like I'm talking fantasy
Mm-hmm.
to them.
Yeah. And unions were really a remarkable cause of that kind of American dream, if we want to sort of refer to it as that. I mean, look, we had in the United States the broadest expansion of the middle class in pure, like, no numerical terms in that post-war era from, say, 1945 to 1965, when unions were still very strong, when the federal government was doing all sorts of regulation, when taxation levels were incredibly high for wealthy Americans. If you hate the middle class, you hated that period. But if you do believe in that the American dream is having access to the middle class, being able to rise above from sort of a working class upbringing into the middle class, then that was the period that you have to look upon, where the wages between the owners of the shop and the workers in the shop were as narrow as they ever have been. And now it's, we're back into late 19th century periods again. We've got this huge expansion of wealth inequality. But that period from 1945 to 1965 is really when you have the broadest middle class. And this gets to something that Jack mentioned earlier, which is, if you want to know when liberals were at their strongest in American life, despite all the criticisms you want to heap on them, it most definitely is from 1933, when Franklin Delano Roosevelt sort of introduced that term in American politics, to 1965. This period that we've already talked about was sort of the start of the decline, the drastic decline of American liberalism. So as much as we all want to hate white liberals, and we do, and for good reason, and if you spend any time on the internet, you see all this sort of trash heap upon liberals everywhere. But if you believe in having an expansive middle class, if you believe in having social dynamism where you can move from one period, from one class quintile to another class quintile, when you believe in the expansion of federal government, when you believe in the expansion of regulations, this period that was the liberal era, the peak of the white liberal power, was that era when that was in place. Now, I'm not saying that white liberals didn't bring about their own demise, because you could certainly make that case, and they certainly carry a huge amount of culpability in the decline of this rule. But I mean, I do think some credit should go where credit deserves.
What I find interesting, and this is the last thing I have to say about the Taft-Hartley Act, is that I'm going to guess that Congress was full of white liberals.
Yes, of both parties. Absolutely. So there was a time, it's hard for us to imagine today maybe, but when there were liberal Republicans. And you can even see Dwight Eisenhower as a liberal who bought into the central ideas of liberalism, which were to expand individual freedoms in our society. We need to have a pretty broad social safety net that might include expansive healthcare even, but also expansive retirement plans, also in a broad economic leveling tax plan, and where the federal government can intervene to ensure the growth of the American economy. Now, Eisenhower and Kennedy, so it's not just a Republican thing, did it in really interesting ways. So in the mid-1950s, when there was sort of an economic recession, Eisenhower's attempts to successfully end that was to raise government spending. Now, how he did it was he raised government spending in military defense. So McDonnell Douglas had to build more airplanes, but McDonnell Douglas, based on the West Coast, employs a lot of people. And then all of a sudden they started hiring at McDonnell Douglas, and wages started going up in the Los Angeles and San Francisco and San Diego areas. And that sort of put more money in the economy, and it ended the recession in some ways. So there is this sense that the government has an affirmative role to play in continually making sure that the government is or the economy is stable and continuing to grow. So yes, you are correct that there were liberals who were voting for Taft-Hartley and ending some of the union engagement. And one of the things that I find really interesting is it seems like the United States, as a historian, makes significant sort of progress in the move towards social justice when the left and the liberal center are united. So
Yes.
during the Great
Yes.
So during the So during the Great Depression, you can even go to the Progressive era. Before that, you can go to the Reconstruction period. Before that, where you have the radical Republicans during, in the 1860s, lining up with sort of the Abraham Lincoln centrists, and they were bringing about all this tremendous change. The Progressive era, similarly, the New Deal is really a big moment when you have a lot of the left, maybe not the far communist left, although the communists were definitely opposed to the New Deal because the New Deal buttressed capitalism. But you get sort of the left and the center working together. And that's when you have the greatest expansion in American sort of social justice movements. And that's sort of what we're seeing happen right now in our time, where you get this. I don't know if you followed the mayoral campaign in New York City. How
Sure.
could you not? Because it seems like every journalist in America lives in New York City, and this was the most important event to happen. But that's what that was. It was sort of, Cuomo representing the liberal or the moderate center, which was very business friendly and very friendly with corporations and things like that. And then you get Mondami, who is sort of representing the more farther left regions of that. And so there's this battle going on. They're not unified right now. And if you want to know one reason why the Democratic Party looks so inept in its power to oppose the sort of Republican Trump governing regime, that might be one reason we can look to history and say, aha.
I think that we can answer this question about why the Democrats are so inept by going to our next topic, which is positive polarization and William F. Buckley. Take it, Professor Schultz.
Yeah, so positive polarization stems from Buckley, but it's not Buckley's phrase. It's even a more nefarious origin. It comes from Spiro Agnew, the then sitting vice president of the United States of America, who was the vice president until he was forced to resign under Richard Nixon, of course. So Spiro Agnew is a pretty hateful guy in a lot of ways. And I think there are really two reasons why I hate the guy so much. Just to be blunt about it. And the first was, he seemed like he was kind of an all right guy. He got his start in politics, not necessarily because he was like a political activist. I mean, he wasn't even involved in politics. He was somebody who was always trying to reach above his station, and he had this sort of working class origins. He was the son of a grocer, and his dad was very much sort of like a authoritarian figure in his life. And his whole life was about order. And without order, you end up in disarray. So then he gets involved. He literally started his political career by joining the PTA in Delaware, and it's Delaware, Maryland. In Maryland. Yeah, I knew Delaware was wrong. In Maryland, and he becomes the president of the PTA, and then he starts getting involved in like county level politics, and then he becomes the governor, and then eventually he randomly, much to the surprise of everybody in the Republican Party, gets tapped by Richard Nixon to be the vice president during Nixon's first term. So there's like this sense that like here's this grassroots guy who is working his way from the PTA up. Like, what's not to like about him? But what's not to like about him is, well, there's many things, but he's not really an ideologue. He has no ideas at all. He just wants success for himself. So he wants to become a Democrat because the Democratic Party is strongest in Maryland. But he was a lawyer who he worked with said, oh, look, there's too many talented Democrats here. If you want to go anywhere in Maryland politics, you should become a Republican. And he says, okay. He has no idea what any of these parties believe in. He just decides to go with the wind, and he becomes a Republican just on a whim, right? And that's when you sort of see the sort of slip showing in why he's horrible for reason number one, which is he's just a petty criminal. He starts taking bag money. I mean, literally brown paper sacks, $100 bills are showing up by contractors who want to get bids approved by the county that he's overseeing. And then when he's governor, those same contractors come and they want to build bridges, and so all of these people, these guys want the ending of regulation. So they show up and they literally are bringing $100 bills in brown paper bags to his bagmen and even to him sometimes. And he's just a petty, petty criminal. And when he gets tapped to be vice president, he continues this practice. So literally these Maryland contractors are going to the basement of the White House, bringing brown paper bags of $1,500 and giving him money to sort of steer business interests their way. He's just a petty criminal and a stupid one. Like, if you're going to be a petty criminal, at least be a little bit good at it, I suppose.
Well,
but
he was just access to crypto coins.
Exactly. So that was one reason. He was just a petty criminal who was all about, his self-aggrandizing kind of personal quest for narcissistic fulfillment or whatever that might be. But the other reason that I hate him, so that was the first reason. The second reason that I absolutely hate him is because he understood his assignment when Nixon tapped him to be the vice presidential nominee and then the vice president after Nixon wins in 1968. Which is always surprising to people. They think of the 1960s as the Grateful Dead and human beings and hippies, and it was that to an extent. But of course, Richard Nixon ends up as president of the United States in the end of the 1960s, and the Young Americans for Freedom, the sort of right-wing student movement, always was much larger than SDS, the Students for Democratic Society. So you have this conservative component of the 60s that was really sort of outsized in our historical imagination. At least that's how it was for me. Maybe people view it differently. But for me, when you want to buy a costume present of the 1960s, you're dressing like a hippie and you're not dressing like William F. Buckley or something like that. So Agnew understands that there is this divide in the late 1960s, and he understands his assignment when Nixon taps him to be his vice presidential nominee, and that is to be the bulldog, to say the things that Nixon can't say because he's supposed to be this grand presidential unifier. He's supposed to be the president of all Americans, but he wants to have this bulldog below him who's stirring the pot and who's making sure the core constituent voters know that Nixon is really for him. It's funny, Agnew got this label that I think is really funny, because in the 1950s, when Nixon had been Eisenhower's vice president, he was the bulldog for Eisenhower. Mm-hmm. So Spiro Agnew became known as Nixon's Nixon. So that's how it was. He was the bulldog for Nixon. And what he went around doing was he was sort of looking for targets to stir up the electorate and to get all of these suburban white voters out who were sort of uncomfortable with the anti-Vietnam War protests that were taking place in the streets, who were uncomfortable with all the civil rights activisms that was leading to all the so-called riots or the actual urban unrest in 1967 and 1968 after Martin Luther King is assassinated. Where are the people who are really sort of unmoved by the coming apart, what they see as the coming apart of the American project? So Spiro Agnew, starting on right before Halloween in 1969, starts giving these speeches where he is ripping apart not just Black activists, because he knows he has to be careful not to sound like a racist. He doesn't want to sound like George Wallace, who of course is the great national racist of the time. So he has some coded dog whistle politics where he sort of baits the antipathy towards Black civil rights. But his real target becomes the white liberals, those who sort of, are the string holders, like the Godfather, holding the puppet strings, making all the activists happen. You've got all these white liberal intellectuals who are sort of setting the table. And he starts giving speech after speech after speech, ripping apart the white liberals and saying, this isn't a question of policy. This is a question of values. This is a question of culture. They live a different life than we live, we being his people, whoever those people are. And those people want to take away our American life and transform it into something that is cosmopolitan, that is premised on elite success. And then he gives this sort of divide a name. He says, if we have to bring about the polarizing of the United States, this is going to be positive polarization. So this is from the sitting vice president of the United States of America actively advocating the polarization of American life in order to ensure that these sort of scared, frustrated, status anxious white suburbanites will continue to be part of the Republican majority. Now, to get Andrew back to your question, And what we were just talking about, Jack, about the union component of this, who are these white, suburban, status anxious sort of new constituents, which Nixon goes on to famously call the silent majority? Many of them had been the union members of the 1930s and 1940s, or their children, who had used the provisions of the New Deal and the union-friendly environment of the 30s, had used the economic expansion of the liberal era to succeed, to go from sort of the working class into the middle class, living that suburbanite life. And now they're worried that they're going to lose that. And so they're the ones who are actually then punishing the people who are using those same tools they used to succeed. It's kind of this fascinating turn that is destructive in a lot of ways. And that's what positive polarization was.
What I find interesting, and people who've been watching Jack and myself for a number of years, this isn't going to be a surprise. But it seems as if there doesn't need to be a coherent theory or set of policies to make positive polarization work.
Yeah, I mean, that's one of the things I was surprised when I was researching this, was there is a playbook for positive polarization, a literal book you can go and buy at your local bookstore. Kevin Phillips is a great political theorist, very smart guy. In 1968-69, he actually publishes this book. It had been circulating in draft forms, called The Emerging Republican Majority.
Mm.
And it basically, the argument of that book is Kevin Phillips studied all this demographic shifts that had happened after World War II. He studied local election results. He knew where voters were moving. He knew the sort of sensibility. He understood that the Vietnam War might have been unpopular, but the opposition to the Vietnam War, the anti-war movement in America, was far more unpopular than the actual war itself. So what he writes about in this Emerging Republican Majority, this book, which is the Nixon playbook, is that in order for Republicans to succeed, they need not go after what we today think of as the coastal elites. They don't want Massachusetts. They don't want New York City. They don't want Los Angeles. They don't want San Francisco. They can put together a coalition that extends from the South, both the upper South and the lower South, into the Midwest and up through the Dakotas. And they can win all of those votes, not necessarily by putting forward any policy issues, which gets to your really astute question, but instead by making fun of and by pillaring the kind of America that those coastal elites want to bring. So he actually says in the book, we don't want to play to New York City. We don't even want their votes, but instead we want to use them to build antipathy against them so that we can win the votes of the South and the Midwest. And that is what's going to propel electoral success for the Republican Party. And one of the things that he says in that book is that the trick is going to be not to talk about policy, because things like welfare, things like Social Security, things like Medicare and Medicaid, these are all very popular things. So don't bring up policy. He actually says that several times in the book. Don't bring up policy at all. And you're going to have to keep these policies, which we're going to say we're against. Instead, make it about a cultural divide between them and you. Make them seem like they're unpatriotic, they're un-American, they're not really eager to sort of rebuild the divides in American life. Use them as gasoline to fuel the fires for the rest of the country. But if you start talking about policy, you're going to get in trouble, because those happen to be the poorest parts of America. Those happen to have the lowest achievement in education in America. So if you start talking about taking these things away, you're going to lose votes. And actually, this is sort of exactly what we're seeing right now. You know, the third rail of American politics has been talking about Social Security. Mm-hmm. And now that and Medicare and Medicaid are sort of on the table with the second Trump administration. And that's where they're actually starting to see some friction. Who knows how that'll play out? But it is sort of this sort of transformation that we're watching in live time.
So, Professor, do you think that liberals, being the self-reflective folks, are they just too smart to do positive polarization? Is it the fact that they would have to use the weapon of their enemy? Is it just so distasteful? Or are they just blind to it? Maybe they just don't think. Because I've talked to a lot of far smarter people besides you, far smarter people than you. And they just seem to be blind to how politics work. On the fact that being aggressive and being on the offense is better than being on the defense. But whenever I talk to my friends who are liberals, nice people up in Cambridge, in Arlington, Massachusetts, they just don't seem to get it.
So I think there is something to liberalism as it's been sort of developed in the last 100 years in America that lends itself, not necessarily that they don't get it, but that the values that they embrace are difficult to employ in the realm of politics. So let me give you an example there.
Yeah, please.
One of the key cornerstones of liberal thought is that rational conversation can lead people to change and modify their opinions, and there can be this sort of happy middle where people can then all prosper through negotiation. And the key idea there is that everybody is rational. And
I'm going to say that is the Star Trek paradigm. I'm going to go with that. There is. And this is fascinating because you're right, because a lot of us who grew up on Star Trek think, oh, this is the way things should be.
Right. And rational thought is, a cornerstone of liberal thought. It is how we are able to progress and how we are able to have conversations and how compromises are forged that then go on to become laws, and laws shape how we are supposed to behave and act in our society and where our freedom really ultimately arrives from. I think this is the great liberal failing, is that a lot of people don't vote through rational thought, but they vote through emotion. They vote through how people make you feel.
I will say this too, is that, having a psychology background, is that it isn't just voting. It's about everyday decisions. People make their decisions first and rationalize them second, afterwards.
Yeah. Yeah. And one of the things that, say, in our current time, Donald Trump has is maybe not a whole lot of rational thought, because you can pick that apart, and they've been picking it apart for 10 years. And the guy's a liar, and the guy, this makes no sense. And he says this, but does this. But he does have a whole lot of charisma.
Oh, yeah.
And he is able to evoke emotion in people. Mm-hmm. There's a line that is, I can't remember if it's attributed to Octavia Butler, but I think it's actually not from her. But it's, people will forgive you for what you do to them, and people will forgive you for what you say to them, but they'll never forgive you for how they make you feel.
Oh, that is so true. That is so true.
And I think that that's one of the things that, Trump can say stuff to people, and he might piss you off or whatever, but he's going to make you feel like you're part of the team. He's going to make you feel like, or you're not, which is why he evokes such polarizing opinions. I think that is sort of anathema to the liberal mind. Liberals want a fighter. It's okay to have a fighter. It's okay to have somebody who's willing to lay blows on behalf of what is the good, but they don't necessarily feel comfortable playing to people's emotions. And this has historically been the case. There's a great story. Here's a great story. I love this story. So John F. Kennedy's president. I think it's 1963 when this story takes place. And his attorney general, of course, is famously his brother, Bobby Kennedy, Robert Kennedy. And Robert Kennedy sees all the civil rights activism that's happening. So he has this fancy apartment in New York City, and he calls up all of the, not all, many dozens of civil rights leaders. Lorraine Hansberry is there. I think there's several leaders from CORE that are there. James Baldwin is there. And he says, look, we are ushering through what turns out to be the Civil Rights Act of 1964. We are making laws that are going to end segregation in the South. So we need your help. So can we coordinate a response? Can we coordinate a public outcry so that you are working with us so that we can get the votes we need to push this through? And James Baldwin and Lorraine Hansberry are like, you're missing the whole point of the civil rights movement. This is a moral crusade for equality and for us to stand up for ourselves as human beings. One of the great slogans of the civil rights movement that's often forgotten is, I am a man. Of course, it's hyper masculine. Of course, that's maybe one reason why we don't talk about it as much. But it's just asserting this individual moral notion that in the United States we get to be these people, and our Black experience, they were saying, is that we have been denigrated as human beings. So we're not going to, be subservient to any political transformation. We are going to fight and protest and assert ourselves as human beings in a democracy. And the whole meeting breaks down after 2 hours, and they end up hating each other in a lot of ways. And it's because, Kennedy, as a liberal, wants to move forward with laws that are going to shape society. And the civil rights activists are saying, no, this is an emotive response that we need John F. Kennedy to go out in the streets and say this is a moral cause. We need him to go to the Southern schools and march to open up those spaces. We can't have this sort of be a careful chess game, because that's not what is happening right now. They never really understood the emotional aspect of what politics is. And I think that's been a central problem for 70
So
years.
there is an actual rational way to interact with people emotionally, and that's with motivational interviewing. And from what I heard from your talk there, you're nodding ahead, is that I imagine every college professor who's good with communicating knows a bit about motivational interviewing. And if, this isn't a show about motivational interviewing, but oh my God, it is a way to make people feel heard and seen, and to come up with real solutions in everyday life. That being said, is the way to craft these type of coalitions really through positive polarization? Is this the only way for the left and for the middle to really pull it together?
So yes and no. And I would say that in the since 2016, since the emergence of MAGA as a movement and Trump as its sort of trumpet blower, I would say that positive polarization has actually been an ineffective way for the left to mobilize, because all that has combined the left is hatred of Donald Trump and making a mockery of the MAGA fools. Right?
Well, I'm going to say this is that and if it, I'm going to jump in here for a second. That is stupid positive polarization, because from reading your book, and though it's a history, it's still it's a guide, because how there was this farm team for the right on AM radio that really was able to test out these different phrases and to figure out what works. And so when I think about how the left has actually attempted to do this polarization, it's in the most stupid way possible. They didn't have a way to test out these ideas or these phrases. Am I wrong?
No, you are correct in a lot of ways. To be a little more sympathetic to the left, it is true also that Donald Trump has a Teflon quality where things that would disqualify normal candidates, say being convicted of rape, have this ability to sort of slide right off of him and not stick to him. And then why is that is the big question that people on the left are trying to figure out. What is it about this charismatic figure that means the normal attacks and the normal disqualifying credentials are not working with this particular candidate?
And this is the superpower of Donald Trump right here. And he has several superpowers, is the fact that he is able to attract the consciousness of liberals and attack him while they should be attacking something different. They should not be attacking the man. They should be attacking, just as the right did to the left, this ambiguous boogeyman or boogie people. And it's and somehow we haven't on the left or in the center figured that out.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things that we're watching in live time is, look, and there was something to that. Joe Biden, his whole campaign was, when he was successful in 2020 and when he was unsuccessful in 2024, if we want to sort of make that his fault in some ways, which we can have a conversation about. But his whole argument was, I'm going to save America from Donald Trump. That was the whole thing. It wasn't that I care about your needs at the grocery store, even though his policies from 2020 to 2024 are actually give the left a lot to appreciate and admire, even though he never talked about it as much as he should have. He never labeled it. He never marketed it. He never ran on it. He ran on sort of what we're talking about, that
Mhm.
we are going to have positive polarization and the enemy is Trump. And that showed its limitations in 2024 for sure.
And,
And I
and
think,
this
yeah, go ahead.
And this is the problem, is that people look at the wrong thing strategically, tactically. And the fact that the reason why Biden won is because it was in the middle of COVID. And it would have been difficult for any sitting president to get reelected during that time. So people said, oh, we should just attack Trump. Well, no, you got to do the road work. It isn't, like the conservatives have done in like building up this bogeyman over time and figuring out what terms work. So you're just going to try to do the same trick again that happened to work by a freakish accident in 2020 to 2024. Of course, it is predictable almost as much as the clock striking 12 that it wasn't going to work again.
Well, let me say one thing. This will bring us back to the book in some ways. So buy my book, that kind of thing.
Oh,
but
buy the book by
yeah,
all means. I mean, because my arguments have been, informed,
yeah.
definitely. Buy your book.
And
It's a great book.
this is exactly to get exactly what you're saying, is that I think we're watching in live time an awareness of the fact that attacking Donald Trump as your primary campaign strategy, which is to say that version of positive polarization, has limits. And it has proven to be ineffective in sort of the most disastrous ways for the left and for the center. So what we're watching in live time, and we saw it in Mamdani's win in New York City in the Democratic primary, is a transformation of positive polarization to be not solely an attack on Donald Trump and his authoritarian regime as it's portrayed by them, but instead an attack or an attempt to portray the right as oligarchs, to use Bernie Sanders and AOC's language, which I think has some limitations as a phrase. But Mamdani's winning slogan, the second sentence in his slogan of two sentences, the first one is New York City's too expensive. And the second one is, we're running a campaign to make life easier.
Yes.
And so this notion, and this is what Trump really won on, is I care about your bread and butter needs. I care about the price of eggs. I don't know that he actually is doing these things, but this is what he was saying. People were feeling heard. And if the Democratic Party can formulate a message that is not, I hate Donald Trump, but instead, I want to make your life easier, and here's a few suggestions on how we might do that. For Mamdani, it was improving public transportation. It was free grocery stores. It was things that may or may not actually be plausible, but they were actually issues that people feel every single day. How can you do that? Now, I want to say this huge flaw in the Democratic Party in the last 10 years has been to actually do a lot of those things, but not label it, not give it a name. That name used to be liberalism, but they lacked a way to describe their version of what it was they were doing. Let me give an example, okay? So the two big signature bills that Joe Biden passed was the Infrastructure Act and the Inflation Reduction Act, right? The Infrastructure Act was properly named. It was going to rebuild the American infrastructure, and it was going to put a lot of white working class people to work, and it did. It was huge, right? These were gigantic bills, hugely significant bills. And the one that is misnamed was the Inflation Reduction Act, which actually did reduce inflation a little bit, but what it also did was expand green economies everywhere, give tax incentives for solar energy, and it tried to bring certain versions of manufacturing back to the United States. And even more compelling than that was it targeted the areas that were most affected by deindustrialization in the 1970s, 1980s, and these were all red states. So Joe Biden, a Democratic president, was building factories in red states, trying to put the white working class back to work in these spaces. But he never advertised it as such. There was never, a sign saying brought to you by Joe Biden. There was never a label for his policy like the New Deal or like liberalism, as FDR called it. He just sort of never had a way. He was a terrible marketer. Joe Biden was. And I don't know if he had marketed himself differently as, if he would have succeeded. But when poor Kamala Harris got the nod to be the presidential nominee, the only thing she gave us as far as describing that kind of politics was coconuts.
Yes.
So, she said, my governing philosophy was given to me by my mother, who said, you didn't fall off a coconut tree, right? And that's not a way to describe a social order that is devoted to finding a balance between the individual and the commonweal, right? Which used to be called liberalism. There is no word, there's no way to describe this. Barack Obama, as a great orator as he was, he suffered from the same fate. He said, you didn't build this, talking to those rich industrialists who were using roads and universities to put people in, to build their factories and to put the people in their technological warehouses. You didn't build this, but that's not a governing philosophy. So I do think there is a marketing problem that I think is on the left and the center left. And I do think opposing Donald Trump is not the sole positive polarization that is going to be effective, partly because of his Teflon qualities, partly because he is the greatest politician of his generation. I mean, he slayed the Clinton and Bush dynasties in one election. That's kind of remarkable, right?
When you tell your liberal friends, Professor, that Donald J. Trump is the best politician of his generation, does it make their head spin? Does smoke come out of their ears?
I can watch over the course of about 10 seconds, maybe 12 seconds, where the first thing they're saying is, what the hell are you talking about? How can you possibly? And then I always followed up with that line that he slayed the Clinton and Bush political dynasties in 6 months, and he's still the president of the United States. And then all of a sudden there's this begrudging acknowledgement that, wow, Kevin's right. And how did this come to be? And then it becomes a problem that we need to know about, or a phenomenon. It's a problem for many of my friends in academia because, academia sways to the left, of course, but it is a problem for them, but it is a phenomenon. And now we're starting to see great books coming out about charisma by my friend Molly Worthen, for instance, who are trying to describe how this happens in new terms.
Yeah.
Well, I think a lot of that is because of the liberal tendency to want to make, intellectual, rational arguments. They have the idea and they want to make that intellectual, rational appeal about why it's a good idea, instead of bringing in a marketing team to look at it neutrally and say, all right, how do we sell this to the people? Like you were bringing up Biden stuff, like the CHIPS Act, right? If they had sold the CHIPS Act as, we need to make these chips here so we know what code is on it because we don't want China making our chips and infiltrating all our systems. If they had made that kind of nationalist patriotic argument, it could have gotten a lot more like support from people on the right who are worried about that sort of thing and have that kind of nationalist bent to them.
Absolutely. And I think you're hitting on a really important point, which is, why does the left or liberals have such a hard time draping themselves in the flag?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And there is this sense, and I think it's true, A of all. I think that is true. And if you pretend that it's not, you're sort of willfully being blind. So why is it true? And is there a way around it? Is this lots of conversations that I've been having as I've been doing book talks across the country, sometimes with active politicians. And of course, there's this notion that we want to understand, let's go back to the Vietnam War era. We want to understand the anti-war protesters. Like I, have a rational understanding on why trying to stop communism in far-flung places is bad for the United States, and maybe it shouldn't be where we should be devoting our resources, for instance. So I can't just say, my country right or wrong, which seems to be a simplistic understanding that is very effective on the right. And the way that I've been saying this long before I wrote this book, whenever I teach my class, is that I love America, and I'm hugely frustrated with its inability or unwillingness to live up to what it promises to be. And so let's study that tension. And I can drape myself in the flag as long as I'm acknowledging the fact that there are problems, and part of the American project is to constantly improve upon this balance that we used to call liberalism between individual freedoms and social responsibility.
Tell me if I'm wrong on this, because maybe I am. I've been wrong about a lot of things. But
join the club.
If there's like a marketing campaign by the left in the middle, stating that the other side, the right, are un-American, and they are un-American by many definitions, does that not mean by implication that you're more American? And wouldn't that create some kind of bomb, some kind of positive effect in the minds of liberals and those on the left of being, well, they're un-American? That would just imply that I must be American.
Here's the problem with that, is that because of the reliance on rational thought and wanting to see all sides of an argument in order to move forward productively, there is a sense, to go back to what I was just saying, where you can actually understand the complaints of the anti-war left in the Vietnam era, or the anti-war movement in the Iraq War, for instance, which was significantly smaller than that during the Vietnam War. But nonetheless, there were voices out there in that period, which is only 20 years ago instead of 50 years ago, right? So I think there is this sense that the left is never going to drape itself into a similar kind of simple patriotism that the right has been able to manufacture. So I think by portraying the right as un-American, it's only going to go so far. But I think they will get more traction by pushing forward an oligarchic argument that these are the one percenters who
oligarchic is too many words for people, Professor. There's too many syllables, brother.
It's only one word, too many syllables.
It is too many syllables for the everyday guy, for the everyday person. And I have to tell you, the perfect shouldn't be the enemy of the good. So it's like, even if you can make liberals a little bit more American, or feel a little bit more American, I think that's well worth its price in marketing dollars.
I do too. I mean, my instructions, like I've been saying a little bit, is to sort of recraft a marketing image. I was really struck by Mamdani's make life easier.
Yeah, that's it.
Wow.
That's all you can do. That's
all we got to do. And then tap into FDR's New Deal, tap into LBJ's Great Society. And that, therefore, I'm painting myself, John F. Kennedy plays better than Lyndon Johnson for a variety of reasons related to the Vietnam War mostly. But you can tap yourself into an American heritage, which ties you down to patriotism. And I'm going to do what they did, which is make the lives of Americans easier. And embedded in that is an anti-oligarchic strategy. But I agree, there's too many syllables.
Too many syllables.
Bernie Sanders and AOC are going to run out of gas with that one.
Oh, totally. Yeah. You gotta go with just un-American. I mean, at least in my humble opinion, because people understand that. Everyday people understand that.
Yeah, I think it's going to be difficult to play in sort of what once were purple states, like take Florida, that used to be a purple state, 2 elections ago.
Sure. But how long did the right take to actually get their little hate machine working? It took decades. They had a long-term plan. And the thing is, what we don't have is a long-term plan. Our long-term plan is to be nice to people and give them stuff. That does not work. This does not work.
For once, I finally get to disagree with you. Not that I'm disagreeing with you, but for once, I'm actually seeing something different coming out of the left right now, which is exciting to see that there will be a viable left. And it's this. Essentially, we have had the left and the center left has had a gap in leadership where you're stuck with very old Joe Biden, 80-plus-year-old politicians. And 2 things have happened in the last 5 years. One, Trump got elected to a second term. Mm-hmm. And why that is significant in my mind is, there's a couple reasons, but one is the slew of legislation that is going to be passed in the next couple of years, I think, which is going to be very long lasting and very significant. Mm-hmm. But one effect of that is it's going to paint the Republican Party as Project 2025. So the Republican Party, you'll remember, was very split, and Trump was this anomaly who basically took over the Mitt Romney and Lynn Cheney and Dick Cheney components of the Republican Party. And I think if there had only been Trump 1.0 and not Trump 2.0, it would have been an anomaly and the Republican Party might have sprung back to its friendly corporate order. But I think with Trump 2.0, it's now going to be painted as the party of Trump forever. And this has created an opportunity for politicians on the left and in the center to find space with the electorate, to say, look at this guy's cutting Medicaid. This guy is doing X, Y, and Z. This guy's, not a man of his word. And that has invited, this is the second part that I see that is really exciting, a lot of younger, youthful leaders, sort of in the AOC model, but look at Mamdani, who are able to articulate quite simply and effectively what an opposition to Project 2025 might look like. So we're graduating out of that Joe Biden moment where you've got only these senior politicians. And there is actually, for the first time in a long time, a relatively deep bench from, sort of Cory Booker, J.B. Pritzker, you've got the sort of middle-aged 50-year-old kind of folks. And then you've got a whole bunch of younger people in their 30s and their 40s who are also sort of articulating effectively what an opposition might look like that is not just, I hate Donald Trump.
I hope you're right, Professor Schultz. I mean, some people call me a skeptic, maybe a cynic. I hope my fear, I'll tell you what, this is what my therapist says. Andy, you should really talk about your fears. What I'm afraid of is all these well-meaning people are just going to get outflanked by mean, aggressive politicians on the right because I've seen it time after time, and we all have, time after time after time. That's what I'm afraid of.
Well, I will say one of the key, as I've been doing book talks, I recently on Sunday, actually, a couple days ago, I did a book talk with a former member of House of Representatives,
Okay.
and she's actively involved in like cultivating the Democratic opposition and what this looks like in future elections. And one of the things that she said that I think struck me and all the audience members really hard was that one of the things the Democratic Party's learned from Donald Trump is that settling into rational thought is ineffective. And what the electorate responds to are fighters.
Yeah.
And one of the lessons that the Democratic Party has learned in the last 5 years has been that it has to fight publicly, viciously, and vocally on many channels against what they're seeing, as opposed to sort of, and you get, when you might remember just a few months ago when Donald Trump was first elected, a lot of the centrist Democrats said, oh, let him run the country because he's going to pass all this stuff and he's going to run the country to the ground. And then the electorate will have no choice but to vote for Democrats. And I think there's this pushback. So for instance, I think last week, I don't know when this is going to air, so this will all be aged, but what you've seen is Cory Booker taking the stage and spending 25 hours in Congress, sort of just talking about the destructive qualities of this. You've seen Gavin Newsom sue Fox News for $787 million for defaming him. You're starting to see a lot of these younger Democratic politicians start speaking out more vocally and more fiery against this. There is this sort of notion that even if it's marketing or if it's serious, but there is this fight, there is this pushback, there is this no longer this willing to sit back and be sensible and rational and reasonable and try and negotiate your way out of this. I think one of the things that we saw with the attacks on the universities was this great frustration that Columbia University kowtowed in 2 weeks or less, and this great energizing moment when Harvard, at least for a little while, fought back.
Yeah.
And so I do think there is this marketing moment that Democrats are recognizing this notion that people want fighters. They want people who are going to go and say, screw you to this new order that seems to be coming about. And I think that's a marketing and charisma kind of thing as much as it is a policy kind of thing.
Professor Schultz, I think we're running close to being an hour, maybe a little bit over. So, I've seen other podcasts rip off our last question. I'm going to say that, rip off our last question. And the last question is there a question that we haven't asked you? Is there something you want to talk about, whether it's about your wonderful book or about anything else that you want to wax philosophic about?
Oh, I have so many things I want to talk to you guys about. Let me say one thing, just to bring it back to the book a little bit, is that one of the fun lines that I have about the book, and I feel petty bringing up the book, so I'm going to bring up something after the book. All right. So one of the things about the book that I will say is that I learned that because liberals have been under attack for so long, that there is no true singular meaning to what a liberal is. So if you, as a listener, use the word liberal or have in mind what a liberal is, know this: that definition that you have in mind tells me more about your politics than it tells me about what a liberal actually is. So your neural pathways have been set by the right-wing media, the left-wing media, the mainstream media on what a liberal is. And so you might pause before you throw that epithet out into the world and think about who it is that you are sort of crapping on. And it's really interesting, the critiques I hear about my book, I can tell immediately what the politics of that person are by how they're critiquing my book. Not that they're not right about my book. My book has many flaws, just like me as a human being have many flaws. Sure, I'll take those, but it is interesting that I can see exactly where they're coming from by how they're attacking my book. So I would
So you're telling me that you think I'm a Bolshevik. That's what you're telling me right now. Is that what you're trying to tell me?
Maybe, yeah, there might be something to that for a little bit. I don't know about a Bolshevik, but I definitely would imagine that you're coming from the left side of the political spectrum. And that's fine. It's just nice to be aware of what the costs of having that
Yeah.
idea are. And then the other thing that I would say that I think is actually really important for us as human beings is that one of the ways that the right has fully castigated, and I'm going to transition from the book to life here. One of the ways that the right has fully castigated liberals is by making them the thought police, the guardians of political correctness. And here's the key: people without a sense of humor. And one of the ways that Trump has been so effective, and those of us on the left who only see highlights of his talks, we forget this, is that he's really, he tries to have a sense of humor. He tries to be really funny. One of the key successful components of Rush Limbaugh, who was one of the key constituent creators of this world, is that he was funny. Like, you might not appreciate his humor all the time, and you might hate what he's trying to do on a grand scale, but he was able to laugh.
Yes.
And so I think being able to laugh is going to have to partner with that fighter quality that we just described in order to build an effective coalition against, you know, what people are trying to do on the left and the liberal center. So don't forget to laugh.
You gotta laugh. You came to the right place for that. Once again, the book, Why Everyone Hates White Liberals, including white liberals, a history, but I'm still gonna say it's a handbook too. That's just my opinion, you know, coming from the left. Any last words there, Jack Maturko?
No, I'm content to leave it there. I guess the one thing I would say about the oligarch thing is the branding might be weird, but it works in terms of, you know, like FDR's liberalism with like robber baron attacks, like those, like painting them as, oh, these are these people who are so wealthy that they're out of touch, and bringing up, you know, like Bezos renting Venice and all of that stuff as being like, they've just got too much stuff. And it's all of our work.
That's
And
it.
you know, the phrase that he used was economic royalists. So that was FDR's term to paint them, not oligarchs, but economic royalists.
Interesting.
Yeah, I don't know. It worked for him.
Well, you know, I mean, if we had like a team of marketers, they would be able to test.
Well, you know, the thing about bringing in, because marketers who are like solely influenced by how much they're getting paid, like we know that there's plenty of marketers who will work for either side based on who's going to pay them the most. And those people are always going to end up drifting to the right because that's where the money is, right?
Inside, you know, this is what we should do. Just my own humble opinion is somewhat replicate what the fascists are doing. Is that basically you buy a couple of little AM radio stations, you fill it with your own people. You know this is a loss leader. You know you're going to lose money, but what it does is create a farm team of people trying out these different slogans and seeing what resonates. You have people calling in, you get really rough and tumble, and you just work from there about what your terms are going to be.
Well, let me ask you a question, Andy. We sort of have tried that. We have progressive radio out there. We have social media.
Are you talking about Air America?
Well, Air America has a lot of local affiliates.
NPR Light? Come on, brother. You know that wasn't real. You know, I mean, that's
I would go back to saying that it needs to have a sense of humor as well as a large dose of anger.
Well, I think Air America was like, clearly there was a management problem with Air. I mean, because if you look at the people who had shows at Air America, most of them are doing fine. Sam's doing fine. Mark Maron's doing fine. Rachel Maddow, of course, is fine. Like, these people had successful careers pushing their message, but it just wasn't at Air America.
It's very liberal in the way that it was structured. It was big, it was slow, it was not fast on its feet. And that's what you could say about
it was getting into outlets in rural America. Part of Air America's problem was that they were trying to do terrestrial radio at the downfall of terrestrial radio too.
All right, so we can. I don't even
part two. We got to do part two on this.
You know, there might be. I don't know how much time you all have, but there might be an after discussion of this. But thank you, Professor Schultz. This has been great, and I'm sorry. I don't want to seem like I took the piss out of you.
No.
About things, you know, because I can be somewhat me.
No, I don't feel that way at all. This was a great conversation. I love chatting with you guys. This is super fun.
Thank you, Professor. This has been a great conversation.
Yeah. Might need to do.
Well, thanks for having me on. I appreciate it, and I'm happy to come back anytime.
So let's stop not depending on some